Hello again. This is the Mindustry Chat, where faith meets with creativity. On this show, we explore the intersection of Christianity and art, and we explore the contrast that makes it very fascinating. On this episode, I have someone that I would describe as a lawyer, a child of God, a multi-octave singer, a general partner with Nubia Capital. Ladies and gentlemen, he's been my boss. I mean, we've done quite a lot of things music-wise together, and I mean, one of the brightest minds that I've met in my lifetime, and it's an honor for me to have him join me on this episode. Ladies and gentlemen, DAVIDSON OTURU, and we'll be discussing this on this episode: law, faith, and practice, navigating the intersection of Christianity and law. I mean, I was speaking to a few of my friends, and I was saying, who better to have this conversation with a Christian, a lawyer, a minister in the house of God. So I mean, I'm really pumped up and looking forward to this conversation. Welcome on this episode. Should I call you Barrister DAVIDSON OTURU? I like to call him my son because I'm waiting for that feather to be added soon, you know.
Yeah. Thank you, BBT. Good to be here, man.
Yes. I wrote my questions down because this is out of my league. So I don't want to just ask questions off the top of my head. I researched a few questions and I wrote them down. So on this episode, mine is to ask and just leave you to break it down. So the first part we'll be dealing with is the integrating of faith and law. And by faith, I mean, of course, Christianity and law or whatever religion, basically. I mean, people of the other religion also call it faith. So integrating faith and law. Let me ask, how have you been able to reconcile your Christian faith with the often complex and secular nature of law? And how does your faith inform your legal practice? Yes.
Okay. You know, the way you asked that question, I was beginning to wonder, maybe you should have sent your questions beforehand. But it's all good. Yes, I remember there's a pastor in, he used to be in House on the Rock in Abuja. I believe he moved to House on the Rock in the UK, Pastor Edbert. So years ago, maybe like 15, 16 years ago, I actually had a similar conversation with him because he's a lawyer as well. You know, there are some things that you're required to do that if you are not of faith, you would probably maybe do that. And lawyers are actually, what some people don't know is this: when you get called to be a lawyer, you sign up to be ethical in your you sign up to do the right things. In fact, you basically sign up to be somebody who is principled. You would treat other lawyers with respect. You would be truthful to the court, you know, and to the system. Unfortunately, we've seen that in several situations now, lawyers are actually the rule breakers, you know. But for someone like me who understands the place of faith in what I do, I've always sought to toe the right path, you know. Even when preparing court processes or being on the other end of agreements, I always try to ensure that there is fairness and there is truthfulness and transparency in what we do. I was also fortunate to practice law in the sort of law firms where you had stand-up men and women. In several instances, they were Christians. I mean, one of the very first firms that I worked in, the managing partner was a pastor, you know, in the Redeemed. So, yes, you know, so even if I had other plans, that constrained us to ensure that we applied, you know, ourselves accordingly. And in the firm I subsequently moved to, and I practiced there for like 12 years before I moved, you know, into the investment space. We also had very upright people who would do the right thing, even if it meant we're not going to make as much money as we wanted. So it hasn't been that difficult balancing it, you know, because the principles and my approach towards Christianity and my faith ensured that for the lawyers who were coming after me that I trained, they saw how we worked, you know, and so they had to adopt the same approach. I had some instances where some people didn't know how committed I was in church. Maybe I was a music minister. So when they would see me, they'd be like, oh, wow, like they were surprised. And for them, it reinforced something because in my dealings with them, I did the right thing. So they could
Wow.
reconcile my faith with my actions. If I wasn't doing the right thing and they saw me in church, they would probably go to the pastor and say, man of God, this that is here jumping on stage. If you see what he has done to us, but that was never the testimony. So I can say it hasn't been difficult at all because faith first and then your work second.
Wow, that's great to hear. Let's move to the role of Christian lawyers in promoting justice.
Mm.
So, in what ways do you think Christian lawyers can uniquely contribute to the pursuit of justice, and how can they balance their professional obligations with biblical mandate to seek justice and care for the vulnerable?
Yeah, so within the legal practice in Nigeria, you do have a couple of Christian-based organizations. There is Class Fund, which is Christian Law Students Fellowship of Nigeria. So Class Fund is in all the campuses in Nigeria, and it's in all the states in Nigeria as well. So even when you were on campus, you're a member of Class Fund. So I was in Class Fund, while I was in university.
Yeah,
And while I started practicing, there was the option to continue with Class Fund. And then even in law school, there is Class Fund there as well. And what I've seen them being able to do is, provide a cover for Christians who want to work towards advancing certain things. So you see people locked up in jail. You see people who don't have access to counsel. What organizations like Class Fund do is they come together, they do prison visitations and look for people who have been unjustly tried and all of that, or who don't have access to counsel, and they're able to help them, through those processes. I feel like Christians can do more. There used to be this thing of when elections would come around, and then people would go around trying to lobby, people to vote for them. I feel like Christian bodies like that can hold those people seeking elective offices to a higher obligation towards ensuring that there is transparency and there's justice in the system. Just like you see in regular politics, when the elections comes around, people, though they don't carry bags of rice in these situations, but they promise and they tend to underdeliver. I think rather than just waiting around till elections come, and then after elections there's silence, I think they can be at the forefront of promoting justice, because that's what the Christian faith is all about, right? We're supposed to, promote peace, justice, and equity. I think there is sufficient action going on, but I feel like there could be more of that at the forefront of ensuring that certain things are done and done properly. One last thing that I would say is, right now there is this whole thing going on in Rivers State where the president of Nigeria declared a state of emergency. I'm not going to share my views here, but for anybody who has practiced law for a decent amount of time and also understands and hasn't been bought by money, you would be able to know what the right thing is. And I'll just say this, that clearly what has happened is, anyway, no, let me not say that. We're on live TV. Well, I'll say my opinions. But I feel like organizations like Class Fund can actually speak truth to justice in situations like that.
Fantastic, fantastic. Let's go to potential conflicts now between law and faith. Your personal experience, how have you handled situations where the law appears to conflict with biblical principles or Christian values? Let's take that first half and then we'll take the second half of that question. So in your practice, how have you been able to handle situations where the law appears to be in conflict with biblical principles or Christian values? In Nigeria, it's commonly said that lawyers are liars. I'm sure you've heard that.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Some people, would jokingly want to say you're a lawyer, but they'll say you're a liar, so you pick however you want to. So what I will say is actually this. The truth there is this. If you look really at the foundational principles of law, there really is no conflict. Like if you go back to how the common law was developed, and became what it is, most of the justices. So let me give you like a historical approach towards law that we practice in, Anglophone countries like the Commonwealth countries like Nigeria, Ghana, and the rest of them. Was that it started from the UK, where you had the Lord Justices and the courts of equity that were actually people who were, you could call them priests, like they were people who their foundation was the Bible. So when they would apply equity, they would apply principles like, they would look at things like who is my neighbor, and then in fact, in the law of thought, when we look at negligence, we refer to some of the principles. One of the justices then said, "Who is my neighbor?" And then he went to the book of Matthew, and looked at who your neighbor was, and said, "Yes, that this is who your neighbor is." You must went into love your neighbor like you love yourself. But the principle of negligence that we rely on now is actually based on the neighborhood principle, which comes from that case and has basically been codified across the Commonwealth countries, because that is where law originated from. So the legal principles are actually foundational in terms of the scriptures. And we would have this diagram that they would draw in university. Then when we were doing introduction to legal system, they would show law with a circle, and then they would show morality, and then show you where law and morality intersect. So the summary of all this grammar that I've said is that law is actually supposed to follow biblical and faith-based principles. However, there is something that we say that the law is an ass, and that it is whoever rides it that determines what direction it will go. So some people will read the law and then choose to apply it in a way that doesn't favor, other people. I found myself in situations where there were potential clients that came to brief us, for certain transactions. It could be civil case, in some instances criminal. We didn't typically do a lot of criminal, but there were situations like that. And by the time we went through their case file and drew up our own opinion, we realized that they were not telling us the truth. And so we would have to ask, and then they would say that, okay, yes, they did it. And if you said that you did it, we will say, we're sorry, but we cannot represent you, because what that would mean is we have to go to court and lie. And so, but here's the thing there with law, and I'll explain this so that the listeners who don't understand how these things work sometimes, because people will say, but if you knew he was guilty, why did you still represent him? And the truth there is that some people are guilty in terms of it, but they go to court and then the court discharges them. You'll be like, why did the court discharge them? You see, law deals with evidence, not necessarily truthfulness. So if the other party doesn't present the right type of evidence before the court, then you're able to bring what is called reasonable doubt in criminal law. Once there's reasonable doubt, once you cannot say, okay, X happened and then Y was the result, that is reasonable doubt. And once reasonable doubt is introduced, once anybody can question what the conclusion will be, then you cannot convict based on that. So that's why you might know that. Okay, so let me give you this scenario that happened. There was a criminal case, and I was able to get somebody off death row in Sokoto State. He was a vigilante, and with all the bandits and different things happening in northern Nigeria, somebody got killed. They claimed he was the one, but when I went to the prisons in Sokoto State and I interviewed him, he said, no, he didn't do it. So we went through his file. He had been on death row for 7 years. Fortunately for him, they hadn't hung him yet, So when we went to the court of appeal, we argued the case there. We brought all the evidence. All the people who the police and prosecution had put together, by the time we went through what they were saying, it was very clear that none of them actually saw this man shoot somebody. But because he was a vigilante and had a gun, they just clumped him. So by the time we introduced reasonable doubt, the man was discharged and acquitted. So yeah, there was the first case that I did that was criminal that got somebody off their throat, and I was very pleased. But I gave all of that to just show you how, even though the prosecution were on the other side, once we were able to introduce reasonable doubt, we got the person off the hook. Having said all of this, plenty thoughts, the summary is faith doesn't necessarily contradict with our legal principles, but there is the element of compromise that people bring in, whereby they feel, okay, this person is offering me some good money, and if we go to court, anything can happen. So we can introduce reasonable doubt. If it's a civil case, it's on the balance of probability. So by the time you throw in a few things to show that, okay, this was a contract, but it wasn't signed, so there are some technicalities that you say, okay, well, yes, we didn't deliver it, but the contract wasn't signed. The law says that if a contract isn't signed, it's a worthless piece of paper. But by the time you introduce all of those things, the court will now be bound by the principles of law and now say, okay, you can go. So,
interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it is what it is, but
yeah,
yeah, but for anyone who seeks to be ethical in their approach, there are so many opportunities to still make a decent living as a lawyer without having to compromise.
Fantastic. I mean, that was going to be my next question, to say, what guidance would you have to offer Christian lawyers who may be facing that dilemma between handling situations within the conflict of biblical principles and law? I mean, and I think you already hit that on the head. So I'll move to a lawyer's approach to client advocacy and spiritual sensitivity. In your experience, how can Christian lawyers effectively advocate for their clients whilst also being mindful of their witness and the potential impact on the client's spiritual well-being?
So I'll be honest with you, the client's spiritual well-being is typically not my major concern when I'm taking on a brief. So, and for anybody who is looking for something very spiritual in my response to that, I can't form something that doesn't exist, because you see, you're in the secular workplace and you want to be able to deliver on that instruction as it was. So I've had clients that were Muslims, I've had clients that were Christians, and most times their religious or faith isn't my priority. I'm looking at that particular transaction or that particular case. I'm looking at how I can get the best outcome for everyone that is involved. I think some people might approach it differently, but that's how I've typically, looked at it. What I go to majorly is the nature of the transaction. So are there elements of the legality, or maybe not illegality per se, but is it going to require some level of fraudulent approaches? Will there be something that would be unethical, or that would make me have to compromise my position on my beliefs, anything like that? That is what I would typically look at for such transactions. But if there's nothing wrong with it, I mean, I've represented people from American to British to Chinese to German, like from airlines to marine companies, to tech companies, done a wide swath and breadth of, companies, some of them small companies, some of them large companies. I mean, from your Apple to Amazon, done all of that. And I wouldn't be trying to find out, okay, so the CEO of Apple, for example, what is his spiritual stand? Like, that's, or stuff like that. So I don't know if I've answered your question, in terms of how you were looking at it, but for me, it goes to the nature of the transaction, and how can I effectively deliver on this? And is it something that will make me compromise my faith or my beliefs? Then I wouldn't go along with that transaction at all.
Fantastic. I mean, for me, it's the practicality of the answers. I mean, so that there's in Africa where we are. I mean, from there's this expectation that people put on Christian lawyers. I mean, like I was jokingly saying, where people they just assume that once you're a lawyer, you are a liar. It doesn't matter how much of tongues you speak when you are in church. I mean, like you, some of your examples, how can someone come to you and say, yes, I am guilty of this, and you still go to the courtroom to defend the person? I mean, so yeah, is I just want the practicality of these answers so that when people come across this episode, they can learn some facts and away from sentiments and emotions that we place on lawyers who are Christians or whatever faith lawyers practice. Let's go to potential partnerships between faith-based organizations and Christian lawyers. Now, what role do you think faith-based organizations and churches, for example, can play in promoting justice and supporting the work of Christian lawyers? How can these two entities collaborate effectively?
Mm. Yeah. So I think when one watches how the Hallelujah Challenge, usually at the end of it, you hear Nathan Albasi thanking
Yeah.
his partners, and one of the firms he thanks is Simon Cooper's.
Simon Cooper. Yeah.
Yeah, that firm. Some people might not know it, but is actually run by the former Vice President of Nigeria,
Oh,
Dr. Yemi Osibajo.
oh.
Yeah. So and whenever that I see it, it crosses my mind that probably um, the partnership, if it's legal, would probably be okay, helping them to vet agreements, helping them to ensure that they are compliant with, some of the laws around broadcasting, because the National Broadcasting Corporation in Nigeria actually has a few laws around
Oh,
streaming and all of that. A lot of people don't know because things are kind of unstructured in some scenarios. But I look at it as, just ensuring that even if they get into trouble or something happens, or they go out there and say something that might be contrary, they kind of have some guidance, you know, around stuff. If they're receiving money from overseas, maybe some guidance around how to manage those remittances. Do they need to report certain currencies, to the authorities like the Central Bank of Nigeria or the NFIU, stuff like that. So I see that as some form of partnerships that law firms provide, to faith-based organizations, just being those legal partners that can help them through situations like that. Now, the flip side is what can faith-based organizations do for Christian lawyers? We haven't seen too much of that happening, but I think
mm,
um, just being able to create a fellowship of some sort, whereby there are a pool of lawyers that they can, like you have young lawyers who are probably struggling, trying to get places where they can serve. I remember when I was a younger lawyer, one of the places that I looked for in terms of being able to form relationships was actually in the church, because you would want the situation where the church might realize, okay, you're looking for a job, and then be able to connect you with lawyers within the church who are already doing well. I'm not sure that I had much success, around that kind of situation. But I think if churches partner more with maybe like your class firm, that you already have a collection of lawyers and all of that, we
yeah.
might see more collaborations, more entries, give them a platform to come and share in their churches and be able to speak to lawyers there who might not be able to have that cover for Christian lawyers, but then come to understand that there's actually a fellowship or a gathering of lawyers that they can be a part of, that share their faith and might also be willing to help them grow in their career as well.
Fantastic. I mean, do you would you advise churches to have legal departments or ministries, faith-based based ministries generally to have internal legal departments, what are the pitfalls for Christian organizations, churches most especially like that, that do not have legal departments? If they have, if you advise that they have, what are the pros and cons? I mean, so this is like 3 questions in
Okay.
one. Yeah.
So maybe the pros is, in the event that something happens, and we see a couple of those things happen, from maybe buildings getting burnt. I don't want to mention, the church that is building get burnt, but in those kind of situations, you definitely need, in fact, you need legal advice when you are probably purchasing, a building, and then legal advice around the sort of codes, that apply to building. So if it's beyond a certain feet, are you supposed to get a fire truck on your premise? Are you supposed to get insurance? Would it be legal or illegal to do all of that?
Yeah.
If there are partnerships that you want to enter into, having a lawyer that can quickly draft the right type of agreement, to set things going, would be good. Maybe I would regard that as a pro. The con is the lawyer not having sufficient work to do, because for the faith-based organization, they don't have too many legal needs, so to speak. It's periodic. So let's give you a typical scenario now. Month on month, for the churches that BBT, what do? They have their workforce, but they probably have HR. So things like their contracts have already been drafted. A template has been given to them. They just have to edit and all of that. They make payroll. They probably pay their taxes. They use an external tax consultant and all of that. The offering on Sunday, they just pick it up and pay it into bank and split it where it's supposed to go. Month one has ended. So there's hardly much need for the lawyers. The lawyers might then end up doing all manner of things just to justify why they're on the payroll. And for lawyers, in order for them to grow in the profession, they need to actually be actively engaging their minds in solving legal problems. So with there not being too many legal, I'll say probably little to no legal problems that could potentially happen year on year, then it's not really ideal. What they can obviously have an external law firm that they work with, so that if there are situations or scenarios that come out of play that they did not anticipate, then they can just reach out to those law firms who will then deploy, a lawyer to help them out through the situation. So maybe like a pastor does something, and in the day of social media now, things get blown out of proportion, and everybody's running helter skelter, and all of that. The pastor shouldn't be too worried that, and then what then happens in some churches is that they then start to call the lawyers in church. You say, Barrister Joseph, please, can you come? Joseph will say, that means I'm for a state now. I can't come. They will now be bringing out the list. They will say, okay, who is a lawyer in this church? Like, people will now start raising hand. And then maybe one lawyer of 2 years practice is now the one you will now carry to go and solve that problem. So having a firm on retainer, even if it's not much, even if it's on a case-by-case basis, will be helpful for them, because they can just call on them in those situations and they can come to their rescue.
Forgiveness and redemption, does it play a role in the legal system, and how can Christians advocate for these values?
So do you want to unpack, forgiveness and redemption?
I mean, as Christians, forgive so that you might forgive. In fact, there's a stipulated number of times that we are
70 times 7.
As far as scripture is concerned. I mean, so
you will run out of counting, because
So I mean, if we, what role do you think, or do you believe forgiveness and redemption can play or should play in legal system, or should they even play a role at all in legal system, and how can
Okay.
Christians advocate for those values? Because I mean, we're
Yeah. No.
Christians, we can't run away from those values. You know.
Yeah. So some elements of the legal systems are actually based off the Bible. So an eye for an eye, you know, but sometimes it's based off the Old Testament, So an eye for an eye, you know, if you
Yes.
steal, thou shalt not steal, and all of that is part of the framework of what society operates on. So forgiveness can happen, but when you've committed a crime, then you do the time, basically. So um, because the truth is, sometimes the court looks at certain situations, like, for example, a first time offender. That's why
Mm.
you have things like the option of fine or the prison sentence, because the option of fine means that the person doesn't end up going behind bars or to jail. They can actually pay that fine and walk away from that. But you see, if the person pays a fine and then comes back the second time, that option of fine might not exist anymore for them, because they were given the opportunity to go, but they still committed an offense again. So there has to be some form of recompense, But even redemption happens as well in situations where they may have been convicted for an offense, but out of good behavior, they are then allowed to go free. There, there are situations though where somebody is even released, and then that same day that they are released, they go and commit maybe even a crime of murder, And then the question is, why did the system actually let this person go when they knew that he had been convicted of a crime and should have probably spent 20 years? They now did 10 years. The day is released or the week is released, he commits a more heinous crime than that. So when it comes to justice and legal systems, there has to be that balance. In fact, there's what they call the broken window, the broken window theory in law, more like in criminology. And it was applied to its full effect by Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York. I don't want to say what he is now, but at that time, he was mayor of New York and was very popular. But in the subway systems in New York, a lot of crimes were being committed. So the broken window theory basically says that if a window is broken by somebody and you just feel, well, it's a broken window, so it's not a big crime, and you leave it, the next day, somebody might move from the broken window to breaking the door and then doing other crimes, and then there's an epidemic of crime. But the broken window theory says that if somebody does something as small as breaking a window, you bring the full force of the law to arrest that person. You keep going like that. It doesn't matter how small the crime is. You ensure that you punish them effectively. And when they implemented that to its full effect in New York, it became one of the safest cities in the world. So when you have different systems like that and theories that have to be applied in the criminal justice system, it is then difficult to say, okay, let us forgive them because they know not what they do. You don't know what is going to happen the next time. There's an old maxim that says even the devil himself doesn't know the intention of a man. So it's hard to know what humans will do because we don't have that ability to do that. But that's on the criminal and legal justice system. I think as people who are involved in civil suits, there are situations where you can actually forgive somebody. If somebody cheats you in a transaction, you could leave it to God and say, hey, Father, I forgive this person. And then even tell them that you forgive them too. And out of that conviction might come a situation where, while they may not be able to pay you back, or they might pay you back, but in the future, there might be an opportunity for you to actually come through for that person. So I think as Christians, especially when we go into partnerships with fellow believers, we have an obligation to work as truthfully as possible, because the only reason why that person is actually going into that relationship with you is because he believes that you're a believer and you act as a believer. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen. But the question is, do you walk away from that? I believe, yes, that you can actually just forgive them for their trespasses. You can be wiser the next time, but it's a relationship between you and God. And I believe He will bless you in situations like that where you allow those kind of things go through. It doesn't mean that you will not pursue a court action. You can forgive somebody and still want to get your money back. They're not the same thing.
Yeah. Okay, I think I'll just ask two more questions, and then we call it a wrap, because I mean I'm feeling like a lawyer already with all this things I'm hearing. I say I'm wearing black and white too.
Don't go and find trouble.
So your personal experience, and I mean I just want you to share if you have any personal experience or insight about how your faith has sustained or challenged you in your work as a lawyer or an advocate.
Okay. I would say that one way that I would say is that is almost a throwback to the last point. You sometimes have clients that would owe you money. And you would almost feel like fighting a lawsuit, against them to try and get the money. Because I mean, you provided services to them running into millions, and then it's time to pay. You have 2-3 years, you're still sending, emails, calling, and nobody's responding. Unlike when they were seeking the legal services and they were prompting them, responding. But in those situations, what I've had to do, not once, not twice, is to just, look at it. I mean, there's a scripture that says that it's not good for brothers, in the faith to actually go to court to settle their grievances. I have to just let some of those things go, and just believe God that because He saw my heart and so that I did it out of, a good place, He would bless me more than what I might have lost. And I've seen Him bless me, in several ways. And I tie it to those situations where I decided to let it go. Some other areas which I think are touched on, and I wouldn't want to flog that, is the sort of cases that I would typically take where I have to rely on my faith and belief, whether I would want to go along with that and how it would look for me as a believer to be involved in those sort of cases. Some of them have been very controversial cases that could be on the front page of the papers, and I ask myself, do I actually want to be involved in such controversies, when there are better ways of just not having to explain yourself? So if you're dealing with a very controversial figure that could lie, cheat, steal, and kill, even if the case he brings to you looks legitimate, you have to ask yourself that, could he have done this? But I'll give you the scenario though, that there was this client, he ended up being a very good client of mine. When he reached out and I looked up his story online, I was like, no. I told my colleagues, I was like, I'm not going to take it there. But they said, because, there was a politician, the stories were not good. I mean, so we had a meeting with him and he had so many documents. I'm not, those documents were probably not less than 1,000 pages. I'm not joking. It took us like 3 months to probably do some kind of forensic going through the documents. But by the time we went through everything, we realized that he was actually the one who was being maligned by his partners, business associates, and all of that. So we took him on and we now started to fight back on his behalf because he had used a couple of lawyers in the past, but they didn't really understand. That there's some lawyers that just want to get it rough and dirty. You just go to court and shout, but we were willing to go through it in a way that when we now were representing him, we had facts, and we were able to fight with him all the way. So you still need to not take things at face value, try and fully understand what those cases are, just so that you can even also be in a position to be a blessing to that person as well by your actions.
Just as an aside, from what you were saying, I mean, I also know that scripture, though I can't quote it exactly where it is now, where it was admonishing that it's not so okay for brothers in faith to take themselves to court. But these days, brothers in faith take themselves to court. I mean, so does that make them less Christians? Or, I mean, in the face of law or in the eye of law, like they say, it doesn't matter. You know.
I don't think it makes them. I don't think it makes them less of Christians because I mean, like I said, you can still love them. In fact, you can even tell them, I've forgiven you already, but this money that must collect.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just how people manipulate scriptures to
To suit their
gaslight
own.
people to
Yeah,
their own sentiments, and
you know that sort of thing too. You will bring out scripture that also says, don't
for
cheat your.
scripture for scripture. Funny enough, there's a scripture actually that I was talking about. If you owe your brother something, pay it. If you don't, he'll take it to an
Before you
officer.
can even go to the altar. Yeah, you do. Before you give your offering. Well, that one was on forgiveness. They said before you give
Yeah,
your offering, make sure. But yes, you're right about that. That
that's
scripture.
scripture. When I read it, I always smile like pay it so that you are not taken to an officer and then take you to the court. My last question, so that we wrap up, is how do you envision the relationship between Christianity and law evolving in the future? And what role do you think Christians should play in shaping that evolution?
Sorry. Do you want to take that first part of the
Yes,
question again?
the first half, yeah. So, how do you envision the relationship between Christianity and law evolving in the future? Yeah, that's the
Okay.
first half of it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so Don, I would say this with every sense of responsibility that we are increasingly getting to a place where law and Christianity are not, I give an example of the beginning where, there were two circles, and then it showed. So I think it's probably getting to this point now because there are some things that have been legalized that the Christian faith doesn't particularly sanction, so to speak. And I'm not going to go into them, but I'm sure that the few things like that, and laws have been passed in different places. I think the world is changing to that point where you meet genuinely good people, who have good intentions. Some of them will even say that they are Christians, but the Bible talks about the fruits. When you look at the fruits, and the foundation of it is just unscriptural. Um, it's going to be very hard for the Christian faith or you could call them the canons, because again, going back to how law evolved, it evolved to a degree from the church. There are canonical laws, that you can actually apply if you want. Like in Italy, places like that, you have canons, so but you can't have that in very secular societies because then there may hardly be any difference between that and practicing Sharia in some places where that is the applicable law. Um, so it's a delicate place to be in history, but I think when we will start seeing greater peace in society and a return to normalcy really will be when a lot of the Christian tenets are adopted as what the laws should be. I'm not saying that we'll then go back to an era where it's the Torah, like in Israel then, where the laws of Moses was the law. No, but just an understanding of where most of these Christian principles lie and their impact in terms of creating a society that is based on how we as humans, were created to function. Um, it's going to be a long walk to that. But I also think too that legislating holiness or Christianity has its own challenge too, because you are then trying to force people to do things. Then I don't think that's what the the New Testament or the covenant we have with Christ advocates for us. People are supposed to come to a knowledge of who He is and then live their lives accordingly. So it's a long walk. It's a delicate balance. And I think just loving people and working with them according to their wisdom and their understanding will definitely be useful and helpful. But it's going to be a long while before we can see, Christianity being able to fully impact on secular laws. What we can do as believers, though, is always act in an ethical manner that shows that we understand what it means to be Christian lawyers in that space, and will do things according to what the law provides, but also according to our faith and belief, which, like I said earlier on, can actually come together without there being a compromise.
Wow. Thank you so much. On this episode, we've discussed law, faith, and practice, navigating the intersection of Christianity and law. And my guest is the general partner of Nubia Capital, Davidson OTURU. I'm waiting for that day where we come to celebrate him becoming a son in Nigeria. I mean, I've been saying this for a while, and I can't wait to see that become a reality. Thank you so much for being my guest on this episode. Sometime soon again, when we have some law things to discuss. I mean, I'm looking into the intellectual property laws and all of those things. We hope to have you come and let's have a conversation again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, BBT.
Yes, sir. We'll see you on the next episode, ladies and gentlemen. Bye for now.